Ok, possiamo cominciare questa sessione. I'll switch to English now because we already had an international keynote this morning by Cormac Hogan, but we're also very glad to have here some other guests, international guests, I would say. And we have two people from VMware R&D, actually the people behind the products we use every day, which is something we're very thankful to you for. We have Brani from VMware R&D from Sofia, Bulgaria. Welcome, Brani. He will speak to us about how to manage server configurations at scale using profiles. It is a unique chance we have to interact directly with these people. And of course, he's available also to take any questions you might have during the session. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
Thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting us. It's actually my first time at VMUG Italy. I've been to Germany and other VMUGs, but never actually been in Italy. So this will be my first interaction here. I'm Brani. Don't read my name, it's really a mouthful. Even in Bulgaria, from where I am, people don't use my actual name. They call me Brani. You can do the same. I've been in VMware since 2010. So it's been quite a journey for me. I started as a developer working on the desktop client, known also as the C# client. Some of you who has been with VMware for a long time probably know it and like it. Then I worked on the Flash-based client. Those of you who've used it probably hate it. We hated it too. It was not so good. And then I worked also on the current vSphere UI, which is the HTML-based one that you are using with vSphere 7 and vSphere 8. I've also worked, my team grew with time, and in my team there are people working on the converter, VMware converter, which was recently revived. We have the Power CLI guys who do the commandlets for Power CLI, and a couple of other applications. Recently, we also started doing the SDDC Manager UI, you know, the VCF UI, and a couple of other UIs like the installer that you use to install vSphere, also the appliance management, and a lot of UIs. My team basically specializes in interfaces, which would include user interfaces, which are graphical, CLI commandlets, and also public APIs. So today I've prepared, I want to talk about the vSphere configuration profiles. It's a new thing that is introduced in vSphere 8.0, and what it does is basically allow you to manage the ESXi server configuration on a larger scale. So traditional way to manage ESXi would be to use either the ESX CLI or ESX APIs and configure servers one by one. Configuration profiles basically allow configuring multiple ESXis with consistent configuration, and it eliminates the need to do host by host configuration. So you're at this point probably asking, didn't we hit this thing? It's called host profiles. And it's true, yeah. Those of you who've used host profiles will feel very familiar with the concepts. Host profiles allowed basically the same thing. The big difference is basically the way it was done. Host profiles had a lot of inherent issues from the way they were implemented. So through the years, we got a lot of feedback that there are a lot of issues with the host profiles. And some of the issues we tried to address, but some of the issues we couldn't address because the architecture was done in a way that didn't allow actually fixing most of the issues with most of the important issues for customers with the host profiles. So configuration profiles is an attempt to solve the issues that we've seen, and the good thing is it's done by the same guys that did host profiles. So the same engineering teams and the same UI teams, everybody have actually worked on the host profiles, and we know what the issues are. We've got a lot of complaints through the years, and this is the attempt to actually improve the quality and usability of the configuration profiles. So configuration profiles basically replace the host profiles, which means that you cannot have host profiles and config profiles attached to the same cluster. Once you transition to a configuration profile, the only thing you could do with the host profile is detach it, nothing else. You cannot attach host profiles, you cannot do any remediation with host profiles, nothing. You can only detach it. So one of the ways configuration profiles actually simplify the experience of the VI admin is that they contain the entire configuration for all of the hosts inside of a single cluster in a single document, which is a JSON document, which is pretty much human readable. Yeah, there are some specifics, but if you know what you're doing, you feel pretty confident even editing this document by hand, which is possible, and we actually encourage doing this. So it's a JSON document that has a JSON schema. So it's validated against the schema. The schema is kept with the current image for the cluster. So each ESXi image will contain a different schema. For example, 7.0 will have one schema and 8.0 will have another. They're mostly backward compatible so far, but there are some new settings that come with the new version of ESXi that will be available only with the new schema. Also, another big difference between host profiles and config profiles is the readability and usability. Host profiles contain the entire configuration of the host, regardless if it is vanilla ESX or you have done some modifications on top of it, which means that even if you take a vanilla ESXi host and then extract the host profile from it, it will be a couple of megabytes because it always keeps the complete configuration of the host. The difference is that configuration profiles actually keep only the difference between the current configuration and the vanilla ESXi configuration, which means that if you have a brand new ESX host and you extract config profile from it, it will be empty. Or there will be a couple of lines, which is mostly metadata describing where this config profile was downloaded from and at what time. This is pretty big improvement because practically host profiles were unreadable. You cannot actually see what you've changed, and you don't know which of these settings apply for vanilla settings and which are done on top of the vanilla configuration. Another thing is that with host profiles, there was a concept called answer files. So you know that some settings in a cluster basically need to be different on each of the hosts. For example, if you're using DHCP in a manual mode, you need to assign an IP for each of the hosts. So this configuration is unique for each of the hosts. This was usually done host by host. So there is hardly any place in host profiles where you can see the entire configuration. And by entire configuration, I mean the configuration which is common for all the hosts, the configuration which is different for each of the hosts, and also the overrides. So with config profiles, all of this is in one JSON document. So you have the profile section of the document which describes all settings which are common throughout the cluster. So all hosts have the same settings. You have also the host-specific settings, which are settings that are specific for each of the hosts. For example, in the case with manual DHCP, this will be the static IPs that are assigned to each of the hosts. This will be the host-specific settings. And also, if you actually want to overwrite some of the default settings in the profile, you have a concept called overrides. For example, if you need to have firewall enabled for all the hosts, but you want to switch it off only for a single host, you can do it with host overrides. You can say this particular host will have the firewall disabled. Also, there is a metadata section which describes from where this configuration profile was downloaded or extracted, and it would contain a timestamp that says when it was created or edited. Another interesting detail is that the configuration profile also allows you to specify hosts by BIOS ID. So BIOS ID is a property of the ESX host which is unique for each host, regardless where it resides. It might be in 2 different data centers or 2 different vCenters even. The BIOS ID is unique property that identifies the host. So you can actually enter configuration for a host in a configuration profile, and the host might not even be in the current vCenter. It might be residing somewhere in another vCenter, or it might be a standalone host. And you can specify the configuration for it, and when you bring the host in the vCenter and in the cluster, this configuration will be applied automatically. So the configuration profiles basically allows you to also set configuration for hosts which are even outside the current vCenter. So some of the prerequisites. This is a relatively new feature. It was introduced in 8.0. This was the first release. So in order to enable configuration profiles, you need to actually enable lifecycle management with the image. This is the prerequisite currently. So if you're using baselines in order to manage the hosts in a cluster, you will not be able to use configuration profiles. You need to assign an image and manage the hosts with a single image as a prerequisite. Also, the hosts need to be on a version 8.0. The reason for this is that there are components called config store, which resides on each of the ESXis. So the only way to kind of use configuration manager is if the ESXi hosts contain this piece of code, the config store. So you need a newer ESXi 8.0. It also requires Enterprise Plus license, which is the same as host profiles. Basically, host profiles require Enterprise Plus, and since configuration profiles are basically the next version of it, it will also require Enterprise Plus license. So in the first release, 8.0, it was released as supported technical preview. What this means is that this is still a fully supported product, and you can use it, and you can use your VMware support in order to get help if you get any issues. But it's a technical preview because we know that certain important components are still not there. And probably the most important, which will be relevant to you, is the VDS support, VMware Distributed Switch. And what this means is that the settings for the VDS, which are related to each of the hosts, could not be part of the config profile in 8.0. With update 1, we introduced support for VDS, but it's in the so-called coexistent mode, which means you can capture the configuration of the VDS inside the config profile, but you cannot automatically remediate. What this means is that the configuration is there, but if you try to apply it on the hosts, the operation will actually not automatically apply the settings. You need to do it manually, and only then you get compliance. So you can see where this is going in update 3, which is not yet there. Once update 3 comes, it is very likely that the full support for VDS will be there. We actually already are testing this feature. It's there, and when update 3 comes, it will probably be there. So in update 3, it is likely that you will be able to capture the VDS configuration and also automatically remediate. So the framework will automatically apply the settings on the hosts and on the VDS, and you will not have to do any manual steps in order to use it. So what are the operations which config profiles enable? First one is you need to turn on configuration profiles. It's an opt-in feature. Like, you need to choose to use it for each of the clusters in order to start using it. It's not automatically enabled. One way to enable it is, we call it the green field. When you're creating a new cluster, you have the option to enable config profiles. The other way is the brown field approach, which we call, which allows you to transition an existing cluster to configuration profiles. This cluster might be fully configured and operational, and you get information what will happen during the transition with your host. So there is a full, this information is captured in the workflow, so you know what the impact will be on this cluster before you actually do the operation. And after you enable it, the next step is basically editing the configuration document. So you can do it in two ways. You can do it in the user interface. There is a user interface dedicated for editing the configuration. It's inside of the vSphere UI. I'll show it in a second. And the other is you can export the configuration profile or extract it from a host, and then you can also extract the schema, the JSON schema, and you can use Visual Studio Code or any other text editor that supports JSON schema, which is pretty much the standard now. And it will give you real-time validation. So as you're doing some of the changes on the document, you will get validation information if you're entering incorrect type for a certain property or some of the values are incorrect. This will be possible also with the text editor. And after you edit the configuration and import it in vSphere, you can do check compliance, which will give you what is the difference between the current configuration of the hosts and your configuration document. And you get a pre-check. The pre-check will basically evaluate the impact of reconfiguring the hosts before it is done, in order to kind of squish the maintenance window and in order to give you information what will happen with the hosts before the operation starts. And then remediation is the operation which will actually apply the configuration on the hosts and will perform all of the steps needed in order to bring the hosts in compliance with the document. So let's go first through enabling. You're probably familiar with the create cluster wizard in the vSphere UI. There is a new option called manage configuration at cluster level at the bottom. And it will be available only if you have decided to manage the hosts in the cluster with a single image. So it's not available with VMware with baselines. If you choose to use this option, configuration profiles will be enabled on the cluster, and a default document, a default configuration document will be generated for you. So you don't need to enter any configuration initially. This document will be an empty one. So there will be no settings. You have the configuration, but it will be empty, which means that it will treat all of the hosts as vanilla ESX hosts. The brownfield workflow is the transition workflow. So if you go to a cluster in the vSphere inventory and go to configuration desired state, you'll see the page for transitioning. It's a guided workflow, a step-by-step workflow, which allows you to enable config profiles. So there are two modes for the transition. One is called quick transition or one-click transition. If this cluster for some reason is empty, you just need to press a button and it will automatically generate an empty configuration document and apply it to the cluster. Since there are no hosts, nothing will happen with your workloads, so it's a simple one-click action. If there are hosts with workloads, then it's different, and you'll go through this workflow where first you need to define the configuration document. There are, again, two ways to do it. You can do it by hand. You can provide an already made JSON file, or you can use some of the hosts in your inventory in order to extract the configuration from them and set it on the cluster. Then there is a validation phase where The backend will validate the document against the schema. If there are any syntactic errors, they will be reported. This usually happens if you have a document, for example, generated with 8.0 GA and you want to apply it to 8.0 update 1. The host will be slightly different, there will be more settings, so you'll probably get some validation errors. Then you have the option to fix those errors, and when you fix it, then a pre-check will be run. The pre-check will basically tell you what will happen with the host, which host will be put in maintenance mode, which host will be restarted, what settings will be applied on those hosts. And the final step is applying the configuration, which is a task, a long-running task. It will run for a couple of minutes in order to reconfigure all of the hosts. And at the end, your cluster will be transitioned to configuration profiles. This is basically the day 0 operation, and now we move to day 2 operations. So once you have your cluster configured for configuration profiles, you usually will want to reconfigure some of those settings, change the settings, which is done through a concept we call a draft. So basically, once you want to change the setting, you create a different document in the system, which is called draft. This happens automatically from the user interface. And you can work on this draft for an indefinite amount of time. Sometimes, in order to figure out all of the configurations, you will need some time or even communication with outside teams. So it's not, we don't consider this a one-shot operation. It's more like you create the draft, you do some changes, we will save it, and then you can continue doing changes on this draft until you're happy with all the changes you want to apply. Once you consider this draft ready, then you can apply the draft. And again, on every edit of the draft, you get validation. So all validation errors will be reported in the user interface, and you can do pre-check. And of course, optionally, you can also export the draft. So you need to save it or send it to another team member. You can do it. Those drafts are saved per user, which means that if I log in as administrator at vSphere local and create a draft, I'll have my own draft. And if, let's say, another team member logs in with another user account, he'll have a separate draft. Multiple drafts can exist at the same time, but when one of those drafts is applied, it's basically the first one wins. So second one that tries to apply his draft will get information that Brani already applied the draft, which was created from the same configuration, and basically need to speak to Brani in order to figure out how to reconcile those settings. So there is some guardrail that prevents concurrent configurations of the same cluster. After this, the next step is running the pre-check. So the pre-check will contain information on the what will be the impact of applying this configuration on the hosts. There is a summary and host level details. Summary will give you the high level information. How many hosts are there? How many hosts will be put into maintenance mode? How many hosts will be restarted? And then you can drill down into the host level summary, which will give you information for each of the hosts which you're reconfiguring. It will say if the hosts will be put in maintenance mode, restarted, or the exact configuration which will be applied on the host. For example, in this case, it's mentioning ESXi system keyboard is the configuration that will be applied after the host is put into maintenance mode. So this is ordered list. The configuration will be applied in this. The operations will be executed in this order. When you start the remediation, it's again a long-running task, and you will see the task running. We have what we call notifications at the top, which will say the task started, the task failed, or the task completed successfully. But also there is a operation details tab. On the operation details, there are sections for each of the operations, so you can use it in order to see what was the result of the last operation of this kind. For example, there is a draft pre-check status, and remediation status, which will contain the result from the last operation that was run. And in case of remediation status or pre-check status, you will see the same details that we saw before running the operation. So there is the summary and details, which will describe what will happen for each of the hosts. In this case, this is the remediation status screen. So this operation already happened. So it is listing the actual steps that were done on all of the hosts when the operation was applied. And so all of those workflows are done through the vSphere UI. There are also other options, of course. There are other interfaces in order to interact with the system. Automation is important. There are several options for automating config profiles. So first one is bootstrapping ESXi hosts with desired config. And by the way, how many of you have used auto-deploy? So probably 3 people. Then I will not dive into details, but basically auto-deploy is a way to configure and add your hosts in the vSphere inventory and apply some configuration to them. It's a PXE boot-based solution which allows the ESXi host to get the ESXi image from a PXE server and install it when ESXi host is restarted. So auto-deploy allowed also, as part of the PXE boot flow, to apply a host profile to a given host. Now, auto-deploy also allows configuration profiles. So you can assign a config profile on auto-deploy rule, and when a host boots that actually corresponds to this rule, the configuration profile will automatically be applied to this host. Another way, of course, is the REST API. So configuration profiles starting from 8.0 GA, they have a public vModel 2 API, which is basically the REST API. Some of you may be familiar, but I'll just mention it. In the vSphere UI, there is a built-in what we call API Explorer. It's under Developer Center API Explorer. It comes installed with the vSphere UI. So if you're using vSphere, you already have this thing. It will list all of the public vSphere APIs that are available on the REST endpoints. So under ESX category, ESX settings, you will see all the APIs that are available today for configuration profiles. Those APIs are fully supported. Of course, in 8.0 GA, they were again introduced as a tech preview, mostly because of the lack of VDS support and a couple of other, let's say, not so important settings. Yeah, I've added, this presentation will be available to you after the conference, and I've added a few useful links. There are multiple video demos of the screens that I showed, and there is also the config profiles tech preview, which explains in detail what a tech preview of this feature means. Basically, what are the things that are missing from the initial releases. And also there is an in-depth guide how to transition from host profiles to configuration profiles. I'll pause here for questions, and I have a couple of more slides which are not related to config profiles, but other things that my team is doing. So I think it's a good place to start for a couple of questions.
If you have any questions, we can take them. I have one in the meantime. So you spoke about RESTful APIs to control this feature. Do you also plan to have like Power CLI commandlets or something like that in the future?
Yeah, they are actually already available through Power CLI, but there is no dedicated commandlets. So in Power CLI, there are two ways to interact with the VMware APIs. One is what we call the handcrafted commandlets. Those are commandlets which developers introduce, and they are usually more user-friendly than the API. We try to do it easy for the people to automate. But there is also the direct API commandlets, which allows you to call any API through a Power CLI interface. Currently, configuration profiles are available through the second mechanism. So you basically have an option to invoke the APIs through a Power CLI interface. So you can use it. Experience it's good. It's not perfect, but yeah, it is okay.
Okay. You can also work with JSON files. You can upload them, modify them.
Yes. That was I was talking about. That basically, since the Power CLI interfaces expose this interface with the JSON, the input of some APIs will be the JSON text, JSON as text, which is not great, but yeah, it's still usable.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bernie. Any other questions from you? Yes.
Do you have in plan to add this feature also on other objects in the vCenter, for example, the permission folder, other thing in the vCenter?
Very good question. Yeah. So configuration profiles internally use a framework which has been developed for a couple of years now, and it is agnostic to the particular domain. So it is possible to use the same framework for other objects. But as of today, it's still not in progress, mainly because config profiles took a lot of time. It was really hard because it requires a lot of coordination. So the framework is one piece of the puzzle, but then you need to find all these teams in VMware which actually provide the particular configuration. For example, keyboard layout is one team, DHCP is another team, VDS is another team, and it took like probably 3 or 4 or even more years in order to make configuration profiles fully functional and allow it to configure each setting. But yeah, this is the direction. So we think this model of applying the desired state is a lot easier for customers because it allows a lot of flexibility, and we are planning to apply it. Again, this is future stuff, so there is no commitment and even no plans, to be honest, in the current phase. Probably the next big thing will be to use this document for the cluster configuration. I mean, like vSAN and other settings which are cluster settings, not ESXi settings. But yeah, this is the general direction. We will try to apply the same approach also for other objects. And there are also some plans to apply it on an even larger scale, but probably through the cloud. So today you can assign the config profile on a particular cluster, and if you need to configure multiple clusters, you need to replicate the same configuration. This could be simplified, and we are already working on a way to simplify it, but it will probably be available through the cloud. Like, you'll be able to use single profile for all your clusters, even for all your vCenters. Like, you'll be able to use it on multiple vCenters. But current plan is, yeah, this will happen in the cloud, in vSphere Plus. Yeah.
Hi. Is the auto-deploy working with images?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think, even before 8.0, I don't remember the exact release, but yes, auto-deploy works with images. And now it also works with config profiles. Yeah.
Any other questions from you?
Yeah, I don't want to keep you away from lunch, so I'll be very quick with the next few slides. Power Actions 1.0. It's a solution that, again, my team does. It allows you to execute PowerShell scripts directly in the vSphere UI. You need to deploy OVA, which is a standalone appliance, and install it in your vCenter. And it will also, with the OVA comes a UI plugin, which will give you a script library and a console where you can paste the PowerShell script and execute it from the vSphere UI. You can also see the results of the execution in the vSphere UI. Some of you may have already used the other feature, which basically allows you recording some of the operations and generating the Power CLI. Those two features work very well together. For example, you can capture create VM operation, it will generate you the PowerShell, and then you can directly execute it here. And also, it allows you defining custom actions. So for example, on a data center or on a cluster, you can define your own action, which will run PowerShell script, which will be executed by Power Actions 1.0. It's available for download. It's based on a SRS, script runtime service, which is also open source. It's in GitHub. VMware converter. Last year we revived the converter. There was 6.3 release. This year we released 6.4. In a couple of months, we will probably release the next one. It supports more and more things. In 6.4, there was a 8.0 vSphere and ESX support, hardware version support, version 20, workstation, Fusion, and other things. In the next release, there will be even more stuff. So team is getting up to speed. When we revived the product, we managed to find some of the original developers from the original converters, which was very good. So they are getting up to speed, and I hope there will be even more goodness coming from this team. In vSphere client, we've brought the advanced filtering feature, which allows you to filter the lists in the vSphere UI by defining custom queries. Basically, define your own filter, which could also be persisted in the vSphere client. Also, we brought up the capacity and the usage summary card, which was removed in some of the previous releases, and now we brought it back. We are also working to backport it in some of the 7.0 releases, so this will be available also for older vSphere versions. And as always, feel free to provide feedback. In the vSphere client, there is the smiley face icon on the top right corner, which allows you to send feedback and screenshots with errors or any message. So through the years, I've seen all kinds of messages, and some of them are like cursing you, some people are praising you, but there are also people that are in doubt. I mean, I've seen messages like, is anybody actually reading this stuff? So you already know at least one guy that reads this stuff. So if you send this feedback, it is very likely that it will come to the developer team. This doesn't go through PMs or other folks. This is a resource that's available to each engineer. So each engineer has access to this feedback directly. And through the years, we've done a lot of improvements. Actually, what you've seen in the previous two slides, the filtering and the capacity card, they were done as part of this feedback. Of course, with the help of PMs and other folks that prioritize this stuff. It's very hard for us to make decisions on our own. We still need to follow priorities. But the feedback is something very important for us. It allows us to correct our mistakes and go in the right direction, because, you know, everybody makes mistakes. The important thing is to correct them and walk in the right direction. And this is the way to provide your feedback. Thank you. And we also have a booth, the vSphere UI R&D interfaces team. You can also come after lunch to talk to us there. There is one more question.
Any integration with AI in the roadmap? LLM? Quickly.
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes, it's Yes, you need to come to talk to me and Minch. That's what we are working on now, but it's still in motion. You've heard the private AI word. This is something which is very hot topic internally, and there are several teams which are putting together the proposition for private AI. So this is a hot topic, and it will definitely be something that you will see in the upcoming months. More information and being developed, yeah.
Any last questions before we thank and say goodbye to Brani? Then thank you very much, Brani, for your session.
Thank you.